I'm Paul DiMaggio. I work for the Soil and Water Conservation District in Jackson County. I've been there for about 10 years, and that whole 10 years I've been getting phone calls from irrigators, all types in the county, and I've seen a lot in the last 2 years, and recently put together a whole bunch of info that I've seen that I'm just going to share with everyone here on just tips and tricks and different ways to be more efficient with irrigation. Also including how to get grant funds and how to actually go from those ideas to an actual project. And since there's not a whole bunch of folks here, it's going to be pretty open. So if you have any specific questions you want to ask me about your specific project or situation, we can go that route. I've got a whole bunch of slides. So we'll take a break partway through, and if I'm just going to throw a lot of info at you, and hopefully that sparks some interest in you and gets you thinking about different ways to be more efficient and effective with this water resource that we all share. All those little letters after my name, it means I'm a certified agricultural professional engineer. I went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, studied with Irrigation Training and Research Center down there. I'm a certified irrigation specialist and a certified ag irrigation specialist with the Irrigation SWCD. And that's all fancy terms to throw out there that says I know a lot of theoretical information. You guys are the ones that know mostly on the ground minute details that actually make the systems function and work. So hopefully you guys I can learn something from you. I always do. Every time I give a talk, I always learn a little something. So yeah, let's get started. So a little bit about our organization, Jackson Soil and Water Conservation District, locally funded by Jackson County in 2006. It's a permanent tax rate limit. We get a certain amount of cents per $1,000 assessed property value. So that means most of the properties in Jackson County pay about $20 a year. And in return, myself and other staff at SWCD are able to come out and do free site visits, free informational visits, mostly with new landowners or when someone acquires new land and our new manager. They can contact us. We're non-regulatory. We can give them kind of the history, help them with mapping, help them achieve their goals for the property. So we're a public service agency, basically. We're here to help you use the resource most effectively.
Does Josephine County have a counterpart? Does Josephine County have a counterpart to you?
So we were just talking about that, and they do, but theirs isn't tax funded. So it's funded through grants only, which means it's based on projects. So to get someone out there to do a project,
it's project specific.
It's project specific type of, whereas we're able to offer just free assistance to an extent, mapping, and we have agreements with Applegate Watershed Council and other agencies in Jackson County to work with them. And we all partner together to share that resource.
And the other thing that you do provide is some funding to assist landowners with projects on their landscape also.
Yeah, so we have a small grant program that we can offer. When I was up to $10,000 for a small flood sprinkler conversion project, up to about $50,000. If it's in a certain area, if there's a big waterfall concern or a big concern for that. Unfortunately, that funding stops at the Jackson County boundary. So we would be able to provide you guys with those small grants from us. But we're able to do, if there was enough need throughout the Applegate, we could pull people together. Our agency could help facilitate getting additional funds with the Applegate. And so we can work on that together. Overall, all the agencies you guys talk to about improving the ditch all have the same goals. Efficient use of water for beneficial purpose without waste. That kind of goes without saying. You only need the amount for the intended purpose, which in most cases is irrigation, and that could be for irrigation for ag production or irrigation for landscape. You want less seepage, leaks, spills, less runoff, more control of measurements. Generally, an efficient way to do that. And also, so that's the ag side of it, and then the public fund side are generally connected to improving water quality of nearby creeks. That's a shared resource for everyone in the community. And so how can those two things combine? And improved water quality of creeks means less erosion and sediment from the flood irrigation runoff coming into the creeks. Colder water temperature in the creeks, so stopping that hot water that's being pulled into the ditch, getting warmed up, collecting sediment and nutrients. How do we keep that water in the soil and growing crops and not let that water get back into the stream? So we look to increase agricultural productivity with all the ditch projects and all these projects like this that have gone around in the state. If you can't find a way to increase ag productivity and to improve local food and fiber for the economy, reduce labor requirements, improve water supply, cleaner irrigation water, then it's not a win-win for the water user and the environment. And so any irrigation ditch improvements have to include that way to increase ag productivity. And more efficient water use means potentially less water diverted for irrigation. You can just leave it in the stream. And so that could be a win-win situation there too. So I'm going to talk about irrigation ditch benefits and irrigation ditch not benefits, negatives. So irrigation ditch similar to this one. This one's actually the Phillips ditch. So these are smaller ditches. The terminology between ditch and canal is usually if you can step or jump over it, it may be a ditch. If you have to have a bridge over it, it could be a canal. I don't know how big your guys' ditches out there. I haven't seen now, but it's like 3-4 feet. Yeah, so these are all pretty smaller ditches in the water world, and there are some benefits to this open kind of ditch system. So it's free water. You don't have to pump it to get into the ditch. You see the water running past, and it's easy enough to see where it's leaking, and you can fix it. It's not all variable. It's easy to address it. If there's a hole, or if there's some blow out. Like artificial habitat, it can add water to the nearby groundwater. So shallow wells in the area could potentially be getting water from a leaking ditch. Livestock access and wildlife, it's a foolproof way to get water to your livestock. There's no mechanical parts. It's really just the water flowing. Cows can drink right out of the ditch, really easy. It can also convey stormwater and act as a drainage around the property or elsewhere. And it can be an aesthetic water featured walking trail, which this one, they have like a little bridge or a little tunnel under there with a tree walking along the path. Right next slide. So that's the benefits that I can determine from the irrigation ditches. There's a whole bunch of negatives. And the Kugli ditch folks were able to add a couple on here that I missed. So ditch issue, you can start with that. Ditch issues in this area that I've seen walking around and talking with a lot of landowners is aging infrastructure. It's usually over 100 years old. Most of them were old mining ditches that weren't specifically made for irrigation purposes. So they may not have all of the modern irrigation infrastructure that they would have if they were created specifically for the purpose of irrigation. Over time, there's been initially there was a few large irrigated acres or areas. So there was maybe 1 or 2 landowners who developed the ditch. They irrigated large acres, and over time they split up the acreage to multiple tax lots, which means more irrigators on the ditch to manage, less irrigated acres, because now there's a lot of roads and houses in different developed areas, fewer professional farmers potentially, just because some folks are they're moved up and don't have the historical irrigation knowledge that they did. They bought the property, they knew. We talked to a lot of those folks, and then large trees along the ditch use significant water and can destabilize the banks. There's a bunch of, when the ditches were initially built, 100%, they chopped down most of the trees to build the dam, essentially along the ditch. And now, over time, trees have grown up on the ditch banks and around there because of the seepage. And now they're really big and they can use a large amount of water. In the daytime, ditches can lose some of their water flow just because of the evapotranspiration, the water is from the streets, and at night, the ditch level comes back up. I've seen that on multiple smaller ditches. Easily choked by vegetation. There's canary reed grass, there's lilies, blackberries. Can easily choke out of a ditch if it's not maintained a couple of years. Rodent damage on earth ditches can be very catastrophic, and that can be cause major issues with liability. Is you get some rodent in there, water levels drop, and digs into the side while the soil is all nice and moist, and then water levels come back up, or it's not seen because it's inside a pile of blackberries, and then all of a sudden you get a big washout side of the ditch. Washes out the street. Steep hillsides are difficult access. The conveyance efficiency of the ditch is a term we use for talking about how much water could potentially be saved by making the ditch more efficient. Conveyance efficiency could be 50%. That's pretty typical for some of these smaller ditches because of the vegetation around it, because of the steep slope, because of the leaky area, because they're old. So you could expect to divert maybe 4 CFS and then maybe have 2 CFS at the end or at the middle of the ditch. Last properties on the ditch might not get all of their allotted water right because we divert based on the total water right, but then by the time it gets to the end of the ditch, you've lost 50% of that. So the people at the end are getting 50% of the water on the water right. So there's a generally unequal distribution of water. People at the beginning of the ditch get most of their water. It's always flowing past. There's not a big loss between their property and diversion. So they're getting their nice stream of water. People at the end sometimes getting minimal water, or sometimes they get too much water. Another thing, so ditch associations might have minimal funds for infrastructure improvements. So dues might be low, or dues may have been set 20 years ago, 30 years ago, haven't been adjusted for the price of materials and the prices now. Similar things happening with TID, MID, and RIDLB, and road credit. Is the unwillingness to increase those dues to keep up with the changing times, or unwillingness to use funds for improvements. So if there are funds available, you might keep those just for liability's sake if something blows out. But who wants to spend the money and extra money to constantly make improvements and to gain a couple % efficiency in certain sections of the ditch? Infrastructure is good enough. So we're getting enough water to grow enough crops to meet our EFU tax status, and that's totally fine. We don't want to spend a lot of money to get our maximum water because we just don't need it. The infrastructure is good enough. That's fine. Water is diverted whether or not crops need it. So the ditches have a diversion structure. Water flows in at the water right starting mid-April or beginning April. And crops don't need all that water being in April because that water right is for the middle of summer. So you're taking too much water at the beginning, and then maybe you don't have enough in the middle of summer, and then maybe you have too much at the end, or generally not enough at the end. So you're just diverting the water. It's difficult to manage the water when it's not measured. So do you guys have meters on any of your individual turnouts along the ditch, so your individual gate? I haven't heard a yes on that question yet. There's a meter at the beginning of the ditch, because that's tied to the water right. But the individual users aren't metered because it's generally on a rotation. And so it's super difficult to manage the water and to know how much you're using year to year, or how much your neighbor is using versus how much you're getting, because there's no measurement device. You can kind of eyeball it within 10 to 20%, but there's really no way, concrete way to decide who's getting the water, who's not. The cost of water is basically minimal or free except for labor. So what is the incentive to use less water if the water is free? There's constant coordination with neighbors. So as more properties are divided up, there's gonna be more and more neighbors. And having to coordinate with each of those folks is a problem. Sometimes, you know, for a couple of years, you might have a good set of neighbors, but then one bad person comes in and blow everything up. And the reason I'm talking about all these ditch issues is just to go through the list, because sometimes, and to prepare for this class and the previous one, I wrote all this down, because these are the ones I've all heard. And it's important to think about all these, because it's sometimes better to be proactive about these improvements to the ditch, rather than waiting for these things to even get worked. So access to the diversion to different sections of the ditch can change over time. You may have had a good landowner at the beginning of the diversion, and they moved on to someone else, and then now they don't like you driving onto the property, adjusting the head gate or changing the river. And so that handshake agreement you have with the previous landowner doesn't match with this new landowner. So ditch, same thing, ditches cross multiple properties, roads, public and private, so there's always agreements. A lot of times these agreements aren't legal or solidified, they're kind of handshake, gentlemen's agreements. And they work for a time, but then they don't carry over as diversion. Local governance of the ditch may be loose or non-existent in some cases. Some cases it's not a ditch association. And that just means, you know, what is the governing structure of the ditch? Does it have teeth to actually hold the water users accountable for maintenance, or if the ditch goes out of their section, or what's actually going to happen if something goes wrong? Another issue is that ditches and the seepage and high groundwater tables associated with them potentially create artificial wetlands, which can actually be classified now as wetland, which brings in expedition with regulatory situations, because it's been now a wetland for 100 years. And when they came in and did the wetland survey back in the 70s, or whenever they did it, and they're like, okay, well, this is definitely a wetland because there's wetland plants here, it's saturated all the time.
We have a project site out in Williams that has this issue, and we're trying to put fence the riparian area, and that wetland goes up to that. So then you have the question, does the wetland impact whether or not the fencing can go in also? So artificial creation of wetlands is a really big problem.
Yeah, so
Or
if
can
you were to
be.
pipe that section of ditch, for example, and dry up the wetland, you're not allowed to dry up the wetland unless you kind of create another wetland somewhere else and mitigate it, or do something else to keep that wetland there. And it's a case by case basis, and it's a sticky situation with department.
State lands.
Yeah. So stormwater and upland irrigation could be captured by the ditch, which can also be an issue because stormwater carries with it sediment, other debris that can come and clog the ditch. If there is, you know, your ditch is full in April or May, and you get a big storm event. If someone's not watching the weather carefully and dump some water or turn down the diversion, there could be a blowout if that ditch is capturing a tributary. You know, and this is the one that was added that I forgot about. It's easy for people to steal water if the ditch is just flowing over the water is there, flowing by the property. They don't have a water right to it. They don't know what's going on. They just take some water, put a little pump in there. So now I'll go over some ditch improvement options. And I used to talk more about specific pipe sizes and specific options, but it's really, in my experience, been a case by case situation. A lot of it's based on irrigator's preference or who's leading the project and what their past experience has been. If they've got a lot of good experience with putting in a certain type of pipe, who am I to sell them on something that might be 1% better, or a little bit cheaper? You know, go with what you know, go if you know what you know is gonna work. And we don't need to be splitting hairs to get the ditch efficiency. Material cost and installation cost is a big deciding factor. Material costs fluctuate, installation costs fluctuate. Lifespan and maintenance of the improvement. So I guess it's really cheap to just go in and recompact a ditch certain sections, but then in 3 or 5 years, you may have to redo it. Doing some coffee over here. Whereas a buried pipeline would be expensive, but it would have, ideally 100-year lifespan. So you put it in the ground and you just put it in there, and hopefully you can forget it for another couple of generations. Contractor experience. So I could select the perfect system, the perfect pipe, whatever, and throw it out there. But then if the contractor in the area can't get the materials or doesn't know how to install it, and they install it wrong, the installation is really gonna be terrible. It's not gonna function, regardless of what the material is. That happens a lot with liners. And same thing with DIY, do it yourself versus professional installation. So if someone doesn't have experience with putting in a system like this, and they put the pipeline reverse on grade, even though it's sized correctly, it's not going to carry the right along the wall. Or they don't compact around it enough, and then it settles, and then roots get in between the pipeline joints and clog it up. That's not going to work, and they have to come back and fix it. So professional installation is really good if there's funds for it. So we're looking at ditch improvement options. What they've done in other larger irrigation districts in Oregon, Central Oregon, Three Sisters irrigation districts, so COID, all the ones, some of these larger ones, they've started piping it from the beginning, and they try to get enough funding to pipe it from the beginning all the way, and provide pressure to folks down, because their ditch is so low. And look at that as a big project and then phase it out as there's funding available. So you start from the beginning and you keep piping it down until you get where you need to with a pressure rated pipe. And then that system's going to last a long time. You can bury it. It's going to be in there for 100 years. But sometimes, if you're not a super large irrigation district, and if there's not a lot of water quality benefit or public benefit to that water resource, then there may just not be enough funding available. Like the one that Three Sisters Irrigation District did, they were able to get additional funding because they were able to dump water and created a new hydropower facility halfway down into their existing Bulls Pond they had. So that made a lot of sense to put in this really expensive pressurized pipe down to that section. But some of these ditches, that are 3, 4, 5 miles long, may not have that ability to generate. So if that's not feasible to pipe the entire ditch after we've looked at kind of that big option, then maybe just fix the leakiest section. Might be the most economical solution. Okay, next one. And then also comparing ditch improvement options with pumping. So would we, spend $1 million to fix a ditch or spend $1 million to buy everyone along the ditch a pump? And what's the preference of the individual irrigators or the irrigation association? Here's just some photos of some ditch lining alternatives. You guys may have seen some different ones or similar ones. There's all different types. These ones are rigid liners, flexible liners, plastic and rubber liners. The thick rubber is generally the best. The thin plastic tends to get a lot of holes in it and degrades pretty quickly. Or a tree branch falls on it, pokes big holes in it. And these get a lot of installation. If you install it too tight, for example, in the middle of summer, and then it gets cold, or you put water in it, they'll shrink and tear. Or if they're out in the sun for too long, and if they're in a really sunny area, you maybe cover them with something, cover them with concrete. benefit degraded concrete or shotcrete. This was about 3 or 4 inch thick concrete they put in on the section of ditch from the diversion to a section of ditch that they were able to maintain a little easier. And this seems like it will work out pretty well, but that's, expensive. But they were really good at handy with concrete, so they were able to do it.
What's that south left of it there?
This one's called a rigid liner. It's called a V ditch. And it's pretty expensive, but it bends around and it's more rigid and more robust than this one would be. But it's fairly expensive. And I've seen one landowner put that in on their lateral, the ditch lateral from town irrigation districts. And he seems to like it. But yeah, it flexes too. It can bend around corners, which is a good deal. The flow characteristics aren't the best because it's so bumpy. So sometimes we have to make it a little larger than you would the smooth rubber one. This one is an old concrete ditch, and then there's some plastic pipes shooting into that. And clay or bentonite, which I have a picture of here, is really just the act of going in with a layer of clay that's more than 50% clay, or bentonite, which is a swelling clay, and you mix that in with the soil on your ditch, you compact it, and then when you send water over it, it expands up and it'll seal the majority of that section of ditch. So if you have access to clay on site or nearby, that can be a pretty effective solution. Although with these ditches, if the ditch dries out later in the season, or if you don't have anything covering that bentonite, it can crack. And then the next season you try to put water over it, the water will go in these big cracks, and it may not seal up correctly.
What's the lifespan of these different options?
From what I've gathered, most of it depends on installation. So like for this one, you could have it between a 5 to 25 year lifespan. This one's gonna last a long time, but lifespan is an interesting one. It's how is that defined? And I went to like a training the end of last year, and some guy from Texas did a whole presentation on liners and what was most effective, what lasted the longest. And he looked at something like 2,000 miles of canals that run over the line. And that was his statement was, it really depends on the area, what's the maintenance going to be like on the area. So in areas where someone's going to be in there with a tractor scooping out stuff, you might not put a liner, you might do concrete, or do a liner and concrete over the top to protect the line. And if it's not installed correctly, you can get cracks in it, or the anchors along the outside can fall in, or if it's not sealed correctly at the beginning, water can get underneath and really make it not very effective. So, the short answer to that. Good question. This one, these pipes, so put in, will last over 100 years if they're good. They just won't degrade. And so pipes are a little more, it's a little easier to say for lifespan. This one right here is called an HDPE, solid wall fusion welded pipe. HDPE means high density polyethylene. That's the same thing that they make drip tubing out of. So think of this as a big giant drip tube, except they can't fit this on a big roll. So they have to 50-foot sections, and then they fusion weld the sections together. So they heat up both sides and then they smash it together and it forms one section of pipe. And where it's welded is actually stronger than the rest of the pipe that's a little thicker. And this has gone in, there's been well over hundreds of miles that have gone in Oregon just the last couple of years. Been very effective. And it's not that much more expensive. and it can be pressurized. And when you put a little turnout on the side, you just poke a hole in the side, and they weld on another little stub out with a flange, and then you attach the butterfly valve to the flange. So that's the kind of the gold standard of pipe. It bends and flexes. It's not harmed really by anything unless it's exposed and and there's a thought. Or if someone goes and drills holes in it because they're upset that their water feature got taken up by the pipe. Okay.
They use all that pipe in directional boring, right?
They do. Yeah, because you can pull it, so
Yeah.
they'll weld all this together, and on the Rover Valley Irrigation project we worked on a couple of years ago, they welded probably 500 feet together total, and then they would drag it with some big excavators up around. You can just drag it along the canal bank. So if it's a smaller pipe on a smaller ditch, you'd be able to drag it with a side-by-side or a small tractor. But your welding machine is kind of down on a flat area. But then when you pull in those sections, then you got to bring the welding machine up and dig out a larger space between those two 500 feet sections and weld that. So it's quite a process, and you need an experienced contractor to use the welding machine.
How many contractors are there in Oregon that can put together this pipe?
There's a couple here in the area. Yeah,
Okay.
Brotherton can probably do it, Central. Yeah, there's a couple I've seen that.
But if you decided that you wanted to do something like this, the likelihood of getting them that season is probably pretty slim. So these are going to be schedule out projects.
Potentially, and what may happen is, you say you want to pipe it and you give them an option and say, if the contractor comes in and they have experience with this, they may come in and bid that a little better because they've got experience with it. Ferguson Waterworks sells a lot of this pipe, and they would probably know who can install it too. But yeah, like I was saying before, contractor experience is going to be a big part of the selection. So then there's HDPE corrugated, which is just this ADS N12 corrugated culvert pipe that everyone's seen around that you can buy from the store. It can either be single wall, which means that it's corrugated on the outside and it's corrugated on the inside, which makes it a little more flexible, so it can flex around some curves. But it also means that it sometimes has to be a little bit larger to convey the water through it because it's bumpier on the inside. Double wall, smooth inside, can be a little bit smaller because it's smooth on the inside, but it doesn't bend really at all. It doesn't flex, and it's more expensive. Also with the double wall, usually there's bell and spigot joints, and so they go in pretty easily. But for the single wall, there's no bell on the end. They kind of butt together, and then you have to buy a separate coupler to couple around. CMP corrugated metal pipe. So that's this one here, and this is what was really widely available before the HDPE became more widely available and similar cost. This is good in a pinch, but I've seen a lot that are maybe 30, 40 years old that have a lot of pinhole leaks and are rusted out or corroded out, and they can fail if they're corroded too much. Whereas these ones, the HDPE ones, don't get corroded, and they can only really be damaged by fire. Both of these can melt in the fire, as we saw Eagle Point Irrigation District with the last fire that was up there.
Open chain.
Yeah, the open chain fire. They had some road crossings for their irrigation ditch, and the fire just went through and melted the whole top of the pipe, and they had to go to replace it. PVC pipe can be used. This one, they were at the very end of this ditch, and they decided to just put in this 4-inch PVC pipe with some flexible rubber gaskets here to get it up to their place where they got a little pump. And that seems like it worked pretty well. But you can see this was the size of the ditch before, and they just put in this little pipe. This is all the solvent. We've only got a couple acres down here. We don't need this whole edge like it was previously, so that worked out pretty well. And PVC can either be gasket, where it's just a rubber gasket that's pushed together, and then you can pull it apart, or it can be solvent welded, where the pipes are actually chemically joined together, and they won't get pulled apart. I generally like the solvent weld if that's an option. Usually it's only an option on the smaller diameter pipes. But it helps because then you don't need a lot of thrust blocks or anything to keep it from settling at all to one pipe. And then not shown here is concrete tile, which is the old pipe that the Bureau of Reclamation put in back in the 50s in a lot of places. It's just sections of about this long of concrete pipe with a bell on the end, and you fit those together. And there's still a lot of those in service that are being used. But they're really heavy. They're pretty expensive. They don't bend very well. Yeah.
Do you recommend burying the PVC pipe?
Yeah, I would. I don't know why they have this exposed here, but I think it's just maybe they wanted to see if it worked before they buried it.
Yeah.
But yeah, you should definitely bury any of these pipes just to prevent anything from falling. But sometimes it doesn't make sense to bury it because this one was here, this ditch blew out, and they used this kind of a span on the steep section. And they didn't really have a lot of material to bring them over the top, so it works and it gets the water from across there to there. It was a pretty simple fix. But I would recommend, being in a fire-prone area where it could be fire, if you can bury some of these that won't get affected by fire. That'd be the only reason to bury it and to keep it out of sight and out of mind for passerbys or anything else.
It's animals like chew into the meats. So
Yeah.
it's nice to bury it.
Yeah.
About sediment.
What's that?
What about sediment?
Sediment collection in the pipes?
Yeah.
So that can be a problem. And it can usually go all the way through the pipe and it won't like build up in a pocket and put off the pipe. So it usually just flush through. And a lot of times at the diversion structure, if you're gonna pipe it, there'll be a sediment catchment area that'll be designed at the beginning. That's easy to access, easy to clean out additional sediment. Maybe before the fish stream, where the water is a little bit slower. The water comes into the diversion, settles out a little bit, and then you can come and scoop that out. There's a lot of sediment in these ditches, in the old ditches, in areas where it's wide and the water moves slowly and the sediment settles out. But in areas of ditches where it's smaller and steeper, usually you don't see any sediment. It could be a rocky or gravel bottom. So with these pipes, usually the water's flowing a little bit faster, and so it doesn't collect a lot of sediment. But you do always put in stuff for sediment collection anyways. So if this pipe was to go underneath a river as an inverted siphon, you would expect that maybe some sediment or gravel would just get trapped down the pipe. So you build in a Y or a clean out so that you can get a vacuum suction in there, pull sediment out if you need to later. Or you downsize the pipe to make the water go really fast through that section so it carries all that sediment through. Yeah, have you had any, what's your experience with sediment pipes?
That's why you clean this. Yeah, the experience with sediment, I mean, put an open ditch. That's why you're cleaning, that's why you're cleaning it.
Yeah, if you let the sediment pile up, then the plants get rooted in the sediment and then you get more growth and more housing.
Well, my fear of the pipes is in some areas of the ditch, and it's not accessible as it is, as you want it to do. So if you run the extra feet in pipe, and then the pipe gets plugged up, how do you clean it? You know, call the city, they'll sit back, because you can get the back truck.
Yeah, and I've heard a lot of people cleaning out pipes because of root intrusion.
Well, yeah.
Not so much, I haven't heard too many from sediment from the irrigation district. It's usually because they've put in this culvert pipe. And over time, it leaks a little bit out of that joint. And then the roots find their way in there. And then The roots grow along the bottom of the pipe, and then the whole root ball that comes and blocks. But I haven't heard yet of anyone having to go in and vacuum out sediment from
Out of the plastic.
out of the plastic pipes. It's really just been root intrusion. That's why I like this one, because it's fusion welded together, so roots are never gonna get in, it's not gonna leak. Anytime you have a joint that's not together, welded together, there can always be a chance of a little bit of leakage. Yeah, so. But it is a
They
big,
used a lot of that pipe in Eastern Oregon,
yeah.
the continuous.
It's, the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council has implemented quite a few projects, and I think if you use, if you go to their website, they've got some descriptions of some of their projects.
Yeah, and this is the size that would have came off of one of their laterals. Their pipes that they're putting in the main canals are, 6 feet in diameter. And then they've got these lateral pipes that come off that are about the size of the ditches that are around here that they pipe with this. So for these ones here, some other random ones I've seen, I always think it's best to get a site-specific recommendation from an experienced professional who's done this before. And proper installation is super important, almost more so than what your final selection is. Here's one that was a concrete canal, and over time it's failed, and there's this big gap underneath, and water's just shooting back there. But this does offer a way to prevent a big blowout, and it prevents rodents from eating that side of the canal. This one is a wooden flume that's got a plastic liner on the inside, and it's in a shaded area. It's in a pretty private location, and it seems to be working okay, and there's not a lot of chances for rodents to get through that either. This one is on Gold Hill Irrigation District. Another one for liability reasons was because there's a big development just down the hill here. And this is the big corrugated metal pipe that they just basically put in the existing ditch and then backfill around it. And there's a little tributary that comes in here, and they put a T, and they just catch the tributary water in the big pipe. And this section is, only from basically right behind here to up around the corner. I guess that's been there for a while.
Did I go too fast?
No, that's good. Any other questions on that before I move into kind of funding grant pieces?
Most of the statement made by the person who was delivering the concrete. The lifespan of concrete was about 50 years. So it's not 100 years.
Right. Yeah, like the Bureau of Reclamation put in most of their concrete facilities on the irrigation districts in the Creek area, about 54, 56. And most of them are pretty much failing or have large cracks or settled now. And so they lasted, 60, 70 years. But with the canals that are on these contours on this hillside, this concrete is going to settle over time. Trees are going to grow next to it. And I've seen a lot of cracks and a lot of really degraded canal sections that were concrete. But then in straight areas where it's really controlled on both sides, there's no trees growing next to it, there's not a lot of traffic, you can have a concrete canal in there that'll last a really long time. Like Gold Hill Irrigation District began, or even I think Grants Pass Irrigation District, when they put I-5 in, they had to change around a lot of those ditches. And ODOT put in, or whoever did it, put in a lot of the ditches up on the slope, and it's a concrete channel that they put in, and they still seem to be working really well. But that's because it was put in by a road crew that made it there with concrete. It's a very controlled area. There's no trees growing next to it. Anytime you get on this like curvy area that's out in the wilderness, it's gonna be an issue.
What about earthquakes?
Yeah, earthquakes, can crack concrete too.
I'm talking about, which of these are going to be more likely to be damaged the least by a catastrophic?
Anything that's fusion welded together, when the earth is settling, it's not gonna pull apart. This one would be really good. Klamath has some earthquakes, and some of their irrigation district canals they put in. There's a really large, some of these really large ones of these that are also fusion welded together. And they do have to do earthquake analyses on those. Over in our area, we're not really in a big earthquake prone area, except for maybe the Cascadia earthquake. But yeah, it's not a huge concern in this area for these smaller pipes. Because another thing to think about is if there was an earthquake or if something happened to any of these that go in, and if it does fail, what is that failure going to look like? And is someone's property going to get lost, or is someone going to die or get severely injured? And if neither of that's going to happen, if it's just going to wash out and then it's just going to go straight down into the creek, you don't necessarily have to spend the extra engineering dollars and the extra funds to put in something that's foolproof for that section, because the risk is pretty low if it fails. Whereas in a different area that's behind a residence or
Without the housing.
housing or whatever, or like anytime there's new development in the Bear Creek Valley, and people are complaining about leakage or a blowout, they've come in and just shotcrete the area because it's quick and pretty cheap, and it prevents that catastrophic blowout. It'll still crack and leak a little bit, but it'll prevent like a loss of life or a big loss of property.
They've got a canal on foothills, and they're building right where the old golf course is. They're building right below that ditch now. And I've been wondering why those people wouldn't invest in a pipe system right there.
Yeah, no, quite talking about, and they're gonna upgrade that road to a 4.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Okay. So grants, we already talked about this a little bit. JSWCD, our agency, has a grant if you're in Jackson County. Begin with a site visit with myself or Megan, who's the agricultural resource conservationist. We just do a general intake form, and then we can begin the process of planning and figuring out a budget and if the plan works, and how is that project going to fit, and how is it going to provide the most benefit and most bang for the buck.
What about if the project starts in one county and crosses into the next one?
I haven't had that situation yet, but a case could be made that it would all be one project.
Well, the plus with that is,
It's the new Berry Beach.
well, that and Bridgepoint Ditch could possibly, but the plus with this is that the Jackson County side could get funding, and then you have match for some other funding. And that's what all of these grants are going to require. They're going to require that they leverage each other. So the SWCD funding is the only one that wouldn't be able to cross county line. Everything else would.
So there's also grants from OEB, OWRD, all those other outfits and agencies that have funding, and that's who we usually deal with. So that's Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, OEB, Oregon Water Resources Department, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and there's other ones. Department of Environmental Quality has some grants. There's
BLM Title II, Secured Rural
yeah,
Schools
Department of
funds.
Fish and Wildlife.
Yep.
Has some funds, and it's all for those goals of improving the water to the user, making it really effective for the user, while also providing some public benefit. Okay, thanks, Beth.
Thanks, Beth.
they want to see that it's provided, their money's going towards some type of public benefit that's gonna boost up whatever local community that they're funding. They're not just gonna want to put in funds just to prop up one irrigator, potentially that's not gonna have a big community improvement. It's gotta be kind of a, and I'll go through that more.
Ecological uplift would be
Yeah,
the
I think I've
term.
got the terms on this.
I gotta push a button here. There we go. Doing it. Yeah. This, this,
Here we go. This is it.
okay,
So quantifiable public benefits on any of these grants, it's gotta be a social benefit, economical benefit. So that's, how is it gonna produce more crop and be better for the ag production? Environmental benefit, how is it gonna clean the water? And then the social benefit is really how is that going to, build a community, or is it gonna help some type of underserved community members? And there's typically a year or more of planning for these grants, as you would expect. First thing that would happen is figuring out where and how much water is being lost in the system. And so to quantify that, then you can really see what we can do and how much funds we can get. So our agency and Water Resource Department can go out and measure the ditch, and we measure at the beginning, and then before and after certain leaky sections that you know about, and say, okay, this section here is losing 1 CFS. That would be a good section if we had to reduce the project in type of section. But overall, that is the worst section. The rest of the ditch seems to be okay. And that's what we would really determine with the measurement. And that's a really super key piece of it. And it's called a miscellaneous measurement that Water Resource Department does. It's a point in time. So it can't be used to prove whether you were or weren't irrigating, or whether you can't really be tied to your water right usage. It can't be used against you, because it's just on one day they measured the ditch. You can't really prove much from that piece of information, except you can show where the biggest losses were and justify the project. Another thing that's really important for these grants is determining if there's any water quality benefits. So the ditches might end, and the end of the ditch might just dump back into, like the Cooley ditch dumps right back into Humboldt. I'm not sure what the end of the ditch is for you guys, or if there's water flowing out the end of the ditch during the season, but that would be a place to measure if there was water, to see how much bacteria is being picked up in that open ditch, how hot is that water getting, how much sediment does that water have in it now, and now that water is going back into the clean creek and causing water quality problems. And we can come out and we just take grab samples of the water and send it to the lab. One thing that's important for the economical and social benefits of the users is to determine how much labor you currently spend on the ditch now, as it is, and expected future labor that you may have to expend, versus labor hours if that worst section 500 feet, 1,000 feet was piped, and you initially put the pipe in, and then you won't have to rake any blackberries out of it ever again. And you save that time, which is really saving money, and it allows all those irrigators to focus their time on the on-farm irrigation or some other aspects of the business. And then how will, if you've got more water and you don't have to spend so much time cleaning out the ditch, how will that increase the production? For a landowner at the end of the ditch, this would be a big improvement. But a landowner at the beginning of the ditch, they're not going to see very much. And that's just how it is with this project. But how can that extra water be used to produce more crops and improve soil health improve wildlife habitat, etc. So there's always got to be a point person who's willing to pull together land management. Our agency can't pull everyone together into a project. We're here to support the irrigators, and this has happened with all the other irrigation districts and projects in the area. It's really been driven by either the irrigation district manager or by someone who was at the end of the ditch. They didn't like how much water they were getting, so they became a manager and then got the funding and then gathered up all the grant agencies to help him with the project. And so that's what generally happens, is the person who is going to gain the most off of the ditch, generally the first someone towards the end or someone who's upset with how things are going, will gather everyone together, figure out a plan, and then try to get the other landowners. That happened with, most of the other ditches here in the area. And so local agency support like us, watershed councils is a good place to start. There's Trout Unlimited, Freshwater Trust, Greater Alchemy, a lot of other funding partners. Through the process of all this, there's going to be an eye on water rights, existing easements, agreements, because there may be new easements that may have to come up. Water rights are always reviewed because you need to be able to size the pipe based on how much water is diverted. You can't just go off what the irrigators tell you, because it could have changed over the last 2 years. Someone could have transferred off of the ditch and now they're pumping only from the creek. And so that's less water that has to be put in the ditch or the new pipe. And that's super important. And that's something that Water Resource Department does. And then it's just a constant informational flow, meetings, talk to each of the water users, get everyone's take on everything, and be flexible with the design, flexible with the scale of it based on funding. Like phase the project, so you can do maybe identify the worst sections, do those first, see where you're in, and then do the next sections. And always use someone experienced. And if you know someone that maybe the person installing the project, or you yourself are a contractor and can use equipment and install pipelines, getting that input at the beginning of the project is super helpful, because that will help inform the cost, the budget, really what can be done, how much grant funds have to be asked for. Big part of it. Like with Three Sisters Irrigation District, I keep bringing that as an example, but they actually became their own contracting business and taught themselves and learned how to weld together the pipe, the irrigation district crew. So they didn't have to go out for bid. They did it all in-house, and they saved a ton of money by doing it. So I'm going to go through some just common questions I hear. You guys may have already asked me, but will my water right decrease if I get public funding or grant? And generally the answer is, so the water right is the paper, the amount of paper. That's not necessarily the amount you actually get. And typically, yes, that paper amount is going to be reduced a little bit. And that's because you're providing that water quantity benefit into the stream, or you're diverting a little bit less, because now you're not losing that water through the ditch. And I'll go through some examples here too to explain that. So your flow rate at the diversion might be decreased as part of the irrigation efficiency project, but the irrigated acres are all going to stay the same. The water available at your farm is going to be the same or better, because now your ditch is more efficient. So this example, currently 4 CFS, for example, is diverted into the ditch. That is what is on the existing water right document. But 2 CFS, or half of it, is lost before it reaches, maybe the middle of the ditch. So that means on average, maybe 2 CFS is only available to the irrigators. Irrigators on the last half of the ditch especially are under irrigating during the summer, so we have a 50% loss. The new efficient system, 3 CFS is diverted into the ditch or into the pipe. So the water right paper is reduced from 4 to 3. Maybe there's a tiny bit of loss somewhere. But then now, about 3 CFS is available for all the irrigators to use. So especially the irrigators on maybe the last half of the ditch, now they've got 50% more water. And so that is, any questions about that? Layout of how that works? That's been the case for most of the large irrigation improvement projects here. That's where a lot of these grant funds come from, and that's where that environmental and ecological benefit piece to the grant comes from. If you want to keep the full water right, it's difficult to get some of those grant funds.
There's a value attributed to that water right, or those water rights also. So that is why the funders look at those water rights. If you can reduce it to some extent, you're providing an ecological benefit, and you're basically using that water right as currency to some extent.
The water all has a
depends.
value.
It depends on what size of stream you're on.
And it depends what grants you get.
Yes.
Some grants will require it and some grants don't.
Right.
Right.
I think the key word there is may rather than will. It's not a full-blown, yes, this is something that has to occur, but it is something that will be asked of.
How much will it cost me individually as the irrigator, as one of the irrigators on the ditch? And again, it really depends on the amount of public benefit, environmental benefit, how much water can be traded for funds. Is there a measurement of water quality benefit, measurable water quality? So that's going to determine how much funds are available, how much you can pay specifically. Who's doing the installation can really change the cost. The risk and the scope of the project and the liability of the project is going to be a big piece in it, and that can affect if you can get away with a DIY project that's not engineered versus something that has to be put in by a professional contractor with a professional engineering stamp, because there's some liability attached to it. And then, are people willing to get a loan potentially to cover the cost and pay that back over time with the dues of the ditch association? What kind of debt are landowners willing to incur, right? So, I guess on that last one though, the cost, sometimes the grants can cover 50% of the cost, maybe anywhere between 25 to 75% of the total cost of the project. And so landowners could expect to pay, maybe 25, 50% of the project total. And sometimes that's split out among the landowners based on acreage, or maybe the cost is really just maybe there's already enough dues in the coffer that the irrigation association has, or maybe someone on the irrigation association can put a bunch of labor in and match the grant, and then they don't have to pay a lot of cash. They just pay a lot of labor. How much was the labor value for
Volunteers right now, and this isn't for a contractor rate, but the volunteer rate is $28.54 per hour.
Yeah, so you guys all get out there and rub and prepare the area for the pipeline, that could add up to quite a bit of funds that can be put towards the project. Will the irrigation water delivery be the same? Yes, it should be the same, and it should be better and easier to manage. That's the goal of bidding this project. Will the dues go up? Will the annual dues go up? No, they shouldn't go up as a result of any of these improvement projects. You should have a fund available previously to be able to put towards a budget. However, dues should still continue to increase by a certain percent each year, to cover cost and inflation, increase material costs. And I looked this up, and these can range, different irrigation districts have different ranges. You could go up by 1% to 8% a year, depending on what that group is trying to accomplish. You know, maybe you see that 10 years down the road, you really want to pipe this section, and you know that you need to raise dues by a certain amount to get there. And the reason to increase dues or to increase fees for the landowners is if you have enough money, you don't need to get as many grants. So maybe you can keep more of the water rights on paper, more of the water. Conversely, if you don't have anything to pay, we have to trade more water to get more folks. Annual, go back. One second.
Sorry.
I was gonna say, yeah, annual fees. You guys pay per acre, or is it just, it's kind of a flat fee? We don't have any fee on ours. They're all good.
Wow.
Anybody else have any fees on their ditches? How much do you guys pay?
$25
$25.
So is this what these costs, what you found to be an average?
I couldn't find a lot of public info on
Okay.
these smaller ditch associations. 70 was equal point irrigations.
Okay.
And they're touted as one of the cheapest water sources, because they also have hydropower. So they get extra revenue. And they also rent out their crew and equipment to put folks, and they also get extra revenue out. $500 an acre was Central Oregon Irrigation District. And they have a like $100 environmental fee attached to it that they use for different things around there. So it can really range quite a bit. So that value, does that seem reasonable? You guys being on a short ditch and not a huge staff. Like EPID, you know, they have to pay all their staff members and the manager and all the ditch riders a living wage. So
I would just say it seems really important to establish the percentage increase, because whenever you're trying to give raise the rate at one time, it does not go well with the issue. It's very difficult to do. So when you do formats, it behooves you to set a percentage rate of increase, or every 5 years or something like that. You're not going to establish that. You don't have serious problems in the future.
yeah, and typically, you know, if the rates go up a little bit each year, it's not a big hit on the bill. Whereas if you wait 10 years and then do a big hit, people will push back against that more. And so, yeah, what's your guys' strategy on that one? Is it,
It's being formed.
yeah, cool. Good. Yeah, I couldn't find a solid, it really depends on, you know, what you're trying to do or the budget is for the agency. So it's,
Yeah, but for you guys know what's happening, it seems, yeah, it's something really important. It's
Well,
not just.
a lot of these old ditches, you know, I mean, basically, you know, they were a cooperative effort
Yeah,
between landowners, you know. And that's when you had neighbors that cooperated and got
and killed each other. Let's not be too rosy about the picture.
one thing I didn't talk about too was a lot of landowners now might not even live there, that might not be their permanent residence.
Yeah.
Right.
So they're not there to really help out,
And they have no knowledge of.
Yeah.
you know,
but they might have enough money and they might be willing to just pay into the system, whereas, yeah, so. It's a tough one. It's a tough one with any size irrigation association, irrigation bush.
If there's an association.
You're right. Even
Right,
I don't know, that's kind of nice getting together once a year, clearing the ditch out and checking on it.
Well, like, one of my or this, one of the discs that I had, that it was, at one point, it was a 500-acre ranch. A guy from California came up, divided it up. Now we have a bunch of 10, 12-acre plots in the ditch. And that's and our upper ditch, one of the problems there, the old timers, they passed away. They were the ones that really ran. I mean, they're the ones that made sure that the ditch got fenced.
Yeah.
And the old timers gone, and you got these, myself included, people from California, who knows where, and they don't know dillies. And it's not that important to them. Right, we were talking about trees on the ditch. In the past, when it came time to clean the ditch, there was always one guy with a chainsaw. So, do you have a problem with trees on the ditch? No.
Yeah, and would you ever let trees grow along your dam? On your reservoir? The canal is basically one big long dam. You never see trees anywhere on any dams. That's annoying, or anything with big roots. But for ditches, it seems like it's accepted almost. Right,
It's not my,
people don't want to hike the ditch because they don't want to lose the tree, because now the tree is really nice and beautiful. It looks really nice, but yeah.
one property where some people came in and decided to really clean the ditch. I mean, they were taking down some large trees that were on the easement. And I think on our upper ditch, I mean, the easement, it's what, 10 feet each side or so.
Yeah, if there even is a documented easement. But the irrigation district one is usually 50 feet on each side, which includes 50 feet down from the middle of the ditch too. But for these smaller ones at night, it's really just the width that you would typically need.
Well, I've heard 20 foot.
For maintenance, yeah, 20 foot's pretty standard. 10 feet if it's a buried pipeline for irrigation districts, they usually like a 10 foot in. Yeah, 20 feet, 25 feet. You guys have a written down easement anywhere for your ditch?
No.
So that means it's a prescriptive easement is what it's called. And that will hold up generally,
Yeah.
because it's been there hundreds of years and everyone knows. That's what's happened every year. You have to be blind or not be aware to know what's going on in the ditch. So
Okay, so the other ditch that's having special role. It's just some of this just kind of understood.
so it's called a prescriptive easement.
Prescriptive.
Same with fence line.
So it's not necessarily the paper and
No, but you can see it on all the maps, all area photos, all the property deeds, like it's all there. So next step in doing anything with these ditches is getting the folks out there on site. So that'd be myself, maybe APWC partnership, maybe Water Resource Department, landowners out there, take a ditch walk, identify the bad sections, see what's going on with the diversion, see how the ditch interacts with other landowners, if there's going to be any problems with adjacent landowners. New data collection during the irrigation season, your flow measurements, water quality samples, water rights. And so you would come out and take a flow measurement, usually in July or August, and take the water quality samples around that same time.
So right now, if irrigators wanted to collect some data on their ditches, just walking it with a GPS unit and marking those sections that they think are really bad or need to be addressed would be beneficial and helpful too, wouldn't it? That's information that they could provide to you or somebody that'll help with mapping.
Yeah, or like what you did was just on Google Earth, you just putting pins in them where identified sections. Yeah.
Are you working in conjunction with the water master?
Not conjunction, that's too strong of a word. But we talk sometimes. Yeah.
Because our flow can be, during the summer, our flow can be determined by the water master depending upon what's happening in the river.
Yep.
The relationship with the fish population. Sometimes you get cut off completely.
Yep.
So when you come out to take a flow, measuring the flow, it could.
That's why we don't do it, that's why we don't do it in October. Usually July, like in July or early August. Because then there should be usually enough water in the system where you've got full, full ditch, full diversion. It wouldn't make any sense to measure the losses in the last month of the season when you're not able to take the full. And you don't want to measure the losses at the very beginning of the season because
The last few years, July
Yeah,
has been the last.
You can't say that.
I was gonna.
Oh, really?
At all, at all.
You want to do it at the
Okay,
first.
I better put
You
some-
want to do it right down first of June.
If you guys clean
Okay.
your ditch, it might be different.
What?
If you clean your ditch, it might help.
You don't think I cleaned my
I know
ditch?
you do.
All the way to Wester Road.
I
We're
know.
all the way to Messenger Road, we're clean.
Okay.
Don't even go down that road.
The water master is looking at.
So they shut you off in July?
No, it isn't that, the creek's just dry.
Creek's dry.
We're not
We have a
shut
limited
off.
water supply to begin with.
So the water master is looking at the amount of water in the river. They don't care what's in their ditch. What's in the river.
Right.
Yeah, and it's what's satisfying sometimes the downstream user who might have a senior water right.
Yes.
So if they've got a senior water right and they're not getting their full right, they can call Siobhan or the water master and say, hey, you need to shut off these people so I get my full.
Well, I hate to go back to it, but all those people stealing water is gonna give inaccurate information on what the system is actually supposed to be doing,
Yep.
capable of doing, and what we need it to do in the future.
Yep.
And so all this is like skewed by the reality of what's going on, as opposed to the theoretical and the regulatory and what it's been
Yeah.
set up for and what it's supposed to be doing.
Ideally, you'd want to get as much water in the ditch as possible. So I guess it would be
Well,
May,
Well,
and
but
then
you reported they don't do anything.
As
Because
long
they're
as
finding
someone's-
these people with guns and cartel.
is there anyone stealing water from the ditch itself? After it's just delivered?
Not that I know of.
And there's not a whole lot of places.
There's not that
So
much
then-
water in it.
So then your measurements would still really be just the water.
Yeah, if you had adequate water, yeah.
And if you walk the ditch and everyone's aware and no one's has their turnout open, you should be able to get a good measurement of the ditch. But like you're right, if everyone's stealing water and the water level goes down in the creek, you're not gonna have any water in the ditch and we can't measure water.
Well, even if if it's reduced, my concern is you'd be having inaccurate information to build a system on in the future, we'd be bound to.
Yeah, you always build the system. So I didn't mention this earlier, but you always build a pipe to handle the full water rate. So regardless of how much water is in the river or in the ditch at the time of the measurement, you don't want to put in a pipe that's for that, because then you're restricting yourself to your full water right amount that you should be able to get during a wet year. So even if you only pull 2 or 3 CFS normally, but your water right says 4, and now your water right says 5 or whatever, and then you trade some water in, now your water right's 4, you size it for 4, the water right. Because now then no one can come in and regulate anybody off, because you need to be ready, willing, and able to pull your full water right, to be able to keep the water right.
What
So
about,
you're undersized.
what about situations like our ditch? The county uses our ditch to divert water too during the winter time. Our ditch carries a lot of ditch water from the road.
Okay.
I mean, they have culverts going from the bar ditch on the other side into the ditch. If you had a pipe there, there'd be nowhere for that water to go.
Exactly.
Except for on some property that might not appreciate it.
Yeah, and that point stopped the big project they were looking at in the Medford area.
When the
Because
dam,
there's an agreement between Medford and the irrigation districts. On the city is gonna maintain the ditch in the winter. And then the irrigation district maintains it in the summer. But that's basically all it says. And they don't have any like specifics on who's maintaining what. And I'm sure there's something similar, even less, going on between you guys and the county.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't talk about it.
It's probably not even like an agreement.
No, it's just the way it is.
Yeah.
well, when the ditch failed above my property several years ago, I had 18 inches of water through all my uplands through my barn, through my entire place flooded all the way across.
Yep, and none of that was coming out of the creek.
No, that was all coming out of the blowout on the ditch.
And that was all rainwater.
I understand.
Yeah, yeah.
So that,
So if that's the case, maybe you could double and get the county to pay for some of the pipe, if it also doubles as a way to carry stormwater too, is another way to look at it. Or if their stormwater is going in and it's going down the borrow ditch down the road, a lot of stormwater systems are piped. Because then you have a roadside, you can have a gravel area, you don't have to weed it every time. The county is really concerned, they want a nice clean ditch for stormwater. And if it's piped, and there's a bunch of grants to do that, they might be also on board, they might be able to throw some funds in too. or
it
help
drains the
install.
whole hillside, where's the water gonna get in?
Yeah, so sometimes it's totally disconnected from anything in the creek, so you have to re-find a place for that water to go back in the creek. It's super complicated, and there's a bunch of partners, and it's a super difficult situation. And most of the times, it's too difficult, and it stays as is on those parts that carry stormwater, and they've been doing it like that for 100 years. And there's no direct path for that water to go in unless it goes in the ditch and then goes down somewhere, so.
But the other thing is there's, nobody's going to take on the liability for your outbuildings to be 18 inches underwater because the county didn't maintain the stormwater ditches
Okay.
that are there in the
So
winter.
you're saying the
time.
county's not gonna wanna touch it because they don't want to be liable.
Well, they're not gonna, well, they're currently, that's what they're probably gonna do too. So
If
how can you come up with a solution that benefits both the ditch users and then also helps facilitate that water during the winter time?
And it just wasn't my property, it flooded all the way across 238, all that water went straight, filled up both my ponds, across the property, across the highway, straight into the Applegate River. It flooded that whole stretch of the valley.
So maybe it would benefit them to come up with a solution also. So it's opening that conversation. How do you open that conversation so that maybe there's a solution that benefits everybody?